Dinner was exactly how it had been for years, quiet in a way that felt heavier than shouting. The house on the edge of town sat still around us, the kind of stillness you only notice when nothing has changed for too long. Oak Ridge, Illinois was supposed to be a fresh start when we moved here, a place with trimmed lawns and polite neighbors who waved but never asked questions. Now it felt like a set we kept walking onto every night, to play roles neither of us believed in anymore. The overhead light buzzed faintly, casting everything in a pale yellow that made the food look even more lifeless than it was. Chicken, overcooked, dry, seasoned with almost nothing. Potatoes that tasted like warm paste. I chewed because that was what you did at dinner, not because my body wanted it. Across from me, she sat perfectly straight, back never touching the chair, hands resting calmly on the table between bites. She ate slowly, deliberately, like every movement was rehearsed. Her face was neutral, but not empty. There was a faint smile there, the kind that never reached the eyes, the kind that existed only to be noticed. I knew that smile. I had learned it the hard way over the years. It meant she was ahead of me, that something had already been decided without my input. The silence between us wasn't awkward to her. She thrived in it. Silence was where she felt strongest. The clink of her fork against the plate sounded louder than it should have, sharp enough to make me tense. I realized I was gripping my own fork too tightly, knuckles pale, like my body already knew what my mind was still refusing to accept. This wasn't just another dead evening. There was intention in the air, a pressure that had nothing to do with the weather outside or the quiet suburban street beyond the windows. She reached for something beside her plate and slid it toward the center of the table. The motion was smooth, unhurried. A white envelope stopped just short of my hand. No name written on it, no drama, just paper against wood. She didn't say anything right away. She watched me instead, not with concern or sadness, but with expectation. She was waiting for a reaction she had already imagined, already cataloged. Shock, anger, pleading, maybe even raised voices. Whatever it was, she believed it would confirm what she already thought about me. I looked at the envelope, but didn't touch it. The longer it sat there, the more I understood what this moment really was. This wasn't about what was inside. This was about control, about her need to orchestrate the scene down to the smallest detail. The bland food, the silence, the timing. She had chosen this moment carefully because she thought I was weakest here, tired, worn down, conditioned to accept whatever was placed in front of me. Her smile widened just a fraction, subtle enough that someone who didn't know her would miss it. I knew it meant she felt safe, confident, certain that the ground beneath her feet was solid, and that I was standing on something that would give way the moment I reached for it. She finally spoke, her voice calm and even, like she was commenting on the weather or asking to pass the salt. There was no hesitation in her tone, no fear. She believed this dinner was the end of something for me and the beginning of something easier for her. I sat there, the taste of cold, flavorless food still in my mouth, the envelope untouched, and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not panic. Something quieter and heavier. The realization that she thought she knew exactly how this would go, that she thought she had already won. And in that moment, watching her sit there so composed, so certain of her control, I understood just how carefully she had underestimated me. She finally broke the silence herself, not because she was nervous, but because she had reached a point in her internal script where my line was supposed to come next. Her voice was steady and almost professional as she said she wanted a divorce, the word delivered without weight, like a term from a contract she had memorized weeks ago. She explained it calmly, listing reasons that sounded reasonable enough to tell friends later: incompatibility, growing apart, wanting different things, all wrapped in language that made her sound thoughtful and restrained. There was no accusation in her tone, no visible anger, just the confidence of someone who believed they were being generous by staying civil. She tapped the envelope lightly with one finger and slid the papers out in front of me, aligning them neatly with the edge of the table. She explained how everything was laid out fairly, how she wasn't trying to take more than her share, how she wanted this to be clean and mature. She talked about splitting assets evenly, about not dragging things out, about respecting what we had built together, as if the words themselves could rewrite the years that had led us here. Every sentence was designed to make her look reasonable, to frame herself as a calm adult in the room who had thought everything through. As she spoke, I could see it in her posture and her eyes. She was waiting for the argument, for me to push back, for my voice to rise or crack, waiting for questions she could answer patiently, for tears she could tolerate with sigh, for anger she could later describe as proof that she had made the right choice. She expected resistance because resistance would confirm her power in this moment. It would mean she still mattered enough to hurt me. I picked up the papers without saying a word and scanned them slowly, not because I needed to understand them, but because I wanted to feel the exact moment when her confidence began to slip. The documents were exactly as she said, careful, balanced, crafted to look fair on the surface. I could almost see her practicing the speech alone somewhere, imagining how composed she would look while I unraveled. The pen lay between us, placed there deliberately, another prop in the scene she had staged. I took the pen and signed my name on the first page, then the next, my hand steady, my expression unchanged. The sound of the pen moving across the paper seemed to cut through the room sharper than any raised voice ever could. I didn't pause, didn't hesitate, didn't ask for clarification. I signed every page she slid toward me, methodically, efficiently, like I was closing an account I no longer used. The change in her was subtle at first, a tightening around the eyes, a barely noticeable stillness in her hands. She stopped speaking mid-thought, words trailing off because there was no longer an audience for them. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. I wasn't supposed to make it this easy. When I slid the signed documents back across the table, her fingers hovered over them for a second before touching the paper, as if she needed to confirm they were real. The smile she had worn all evening finally faltered, just enough to reveal something underneath, confusion mixed with irritation. She searched my face for something, anger, sadness, desperation, anything she could use to regain control of the moment, but there was nothing there for her to grab onto. The silence returned. But this time it wasn't the comfortable silence she thrived in. It was sharp, unfamiliar, and suddenly working against her. She opened her mouth as if to say something else, maybe provoke a reaction or to regain the narrative, but no words came out. The script she had written ended too soon, and she hadn't prepared for what came after. I sat there calmly, hands resting on the table, feeling an unexpected sense of clarity. In choosing not to react the way she expected, I had taken something from her that she didn't even realize she needed until it was gone. I didn't say anything after that, because there was nothing left that needed words, and I could feel how much that unsettled her. I stood up slowly, the chair legs scraping softly against the floor, a sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have in the quiet room. For the first time that evening, her eyes followed my movement with something close to uncertainty. She had expected a reaction, some visible proof that this moment mattered to me in the way she had planned. Instead, she watched me move like a stranger, calm and detached, as if the conversation had already ended long before the papers were signed. I walked down the short hallway toward the front door, the familiar layout of the house feeling oddly distant, like a place I'd already moved out of in my head. I grabbed my jacket from the hook by the door, slipping it on without urgency. Behind me, I could sense her still sitting at the table, surrounded by the props of the evening she had orchestrated so carefully. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, no longer something she controlled. I didn't explain where I was going or when I would be back. I didn't offer reassurance or closure. I simply opened the door and stepped outside, letting it close behind me with a quiet finality. The air outside was cold, sharp enough to clear my head instantly. The street was dimly lit, rows of similar houses lining the road, each one quiet, each one hiding its own version of a private ending. My breath fogged in front of me as I started walking, hands deep in my pockets, shoulders relaxed in a way they hadn't been in years. The absence of sound behind me felt louder than any argument ever had. I knew, without looking back, that this was the moment that would stay with her, not the divorce itself, but the way I had removed myself from the scene she needed me to play out. With every step, I felt the weight of the house lift slightly, like something loosening its grip. The sidewalks were cold beneath my boots, the streetlights casting long shadows that moved with me instead of trapping me in place. I realized in how long I had been preparing for this, without admitting it. The emotional distance hadn't started tonight, or with the envelope on the table. It had started years ago, in small moments of disappointment, in conversations that went nowhere, in silences that lasted too long and meant too much. As I walked through the quiet streets, it became clear that I had already left that marriage long before she decided to formalize it. Tonight wasn't an ending for me. It was a confirmation. The calm I felt wasn't numbness. It was relief, the kind that comes when something you've been carrying finally slips from your shoulders. Her plan had depended on my pain, on my visible struggle, on proof that she still had the power to affect me deeply. What she got instead was absence, and I understood how frightening that must have been for her. I kept walking, letting the cold bite my face, grounding me in the present. The town around me felt unchanged, indifferent to what had just happened inside that house, and there was comfort in that. Life hadn't stopped. It hadn't even paused. I was still moving forward, one step at a time, aware that the most decisive moment of the night hadn't been signing my name, but choosing to leave without a single word. Morning came quietly, the kind of quiet that feels deliberate, like the house itself was holding its breath. I woke up before the alarm, already aware of every sound, the low hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the floor when I shifted my weight, the distant traffic that reminded me the world outside hadn't changed just because something inside this house had ended. I didn't check on her, didn't listen for movement, didn't wonder if she was awake. That part of me was already gone. The bags were waiting where I had left them, lined up neatly, packed days earlier during moments when I admitted the truth to myself even if I hadn't said it out loud. Clothes folded with care, documents sorted, essentials only. No hesitation, no last-minute scrambling, no sentimental objects pulled from shelves at the final second. I moved through the house methodically, not rushed, not sneaking, but not announcing myself either. Every room felt neutral now, stripped of meaning, like I was walking through a place I had rented rather than lived in. I passed the dining table where everything had been decided the night before, now clean and empty. No envelope, no papers, just bare wood and silence. There was no note left behind. No explanation, no attempt to soften the absence I was about to create. Words would have implied negotiation, emotion, a shared process. I wasn't offering any of that. I carried the bags of the car one by one, the morning air cool against my face, grounding and sharp. Each trip back in the house felt lighter, as if something was being peeled away layer by layer. When the trunk closed for the last time, the sound felt final in a way that didn't scare me. I took one last look at the front of the house, not with nostalgia, but with a detached acknowledgement, like recognizing a place on a map you no longer need directions to. Then I got in and drove away. The temporary place was outside another city, far enough to feel separate, close enough to be practical. The apartment was small, clean, and impersonal. White walls, basic furniture, no history clinging to the corners. It smelled faintly of cleaning solution and new paint, the scent of somewhere no one had lived long enough to leave a mark. I dropped the bags by the door and stood there for a moment, listening to nothing but my own breathing. No tension, no anticipation, just space. Unpacking took minutes. There was nothing ceremonial about it. Clothes went into drawers, documents into a single folder, toiletries onto a plain bathroom counter. When I was done, the apartment still looked mostly empty, and that felt right. I wasn't trying to rebuild a life yet. I was creating distance. I knew without seeing her reaction that the absence would hit harder than any confrontation. She had expected to manage the process, to dictate the pace, to frame the story in a way that kept her centered and in control. Silence didn't give her anything to work with. No arguments to reference, no emotional outbursts to justify her choices, no proof that she still occupied space in my head. Just a house that felt different the moment she realized I wasn't there. By leaving without a word, I had taken the one thing she hadn't prepared for. Not defiance, not compliance, but disengagement. Control requires participation, and I had quietly withdrawn mine. Sitting alone in that bare apartment, surrounded by nothing but neutral walls and the low sound of traffic outside, I felt steady. Not triumphant, not bitter, just present. The process she thought she would lead had already moved beyond her reach, and the most powerful statement I made wasn't spoken at all. The first signs that her confidence was starting to crack didn't come from her directly, which was predictable, because she had never been someone who risked vulnerability head-on. They came indirectly, filtered through people who suddenly remembered I existed. A mutual acquaintance mentioned, casually and awkwardly, that she seemed confused about how easily I had disappeared, that she had expected anger or at least resistance and didn't quite know what to do with silence. Another message came a few days later, framed as concern, asking if I was doing okay, if I needed anything, if I was settling in. None of it sounded sincere. It sounded like reconnaissance. I read those messages without reacting, without correcting narratives or offering reassurance. The more distance I kept, the louder the absence seemed to become. I could imagine her replaying the sequence in her head, trying to find a moment where control slipped through her fingers. This wasn't how the process was supposed to unfold. I wasn't supposed to vanish. I was supposed to orbit the situation, emotionally available, reactive, predictable. Instead, I had removed myself so completely that it disrupted the story she had already begun telling. It didn't take long for other details to surface, details that suddenly made the timing make sense. Someone let it slip that she hadn't been as alone as she had implied, that there had been another man involved before the divorce was ever mentioned. Not a rebound, not a coincidence. but a presence that had existed quietly in the background while our marriage was still technically intact. The realization didn't hurt the way it might have years earlier. It landed with a dull clarity, like confirming something I had already suspected but never bothered to prove. She hadn't been planning an ending so much as a transition, a clean handoff from one version of her life to another, where everything stayed polished and controlled. The divorce papers, the calm tone, the careful fairness, all of it had been part of that plan. I wasn't meant to disrupt it. I was meant to sign, react just enough to validate her decision, then fade into a manageable past. My role was supposed to be inconvenient, but temporary, understanding that reframed everything. I wasn't the center of the conflict. I was an obstacle she believed she could remove cleanly. The future she envisioned already had a placeholder filled, a new dynamic ready to step in the moment I stepped out. She had assumed that because she felt prepared, because she had rehearsed the emotional logistics, the rest of the world would follow her lead. What she hadn't accounted for was how destabilizing indifference can be when someone expects engagement. The absence of reaction left no leverage. She couldn't frame me as unreasonable or bitter, couldn't use my behavior to justify hers, couldn't even be certain I cared enough to notice what she had already moved on to. That uncertainty was a crack, the first visible fracture in the image she had carefully built. From my side, the silence felt clean. Each day in the temporary apartment reinforced how little of my emotional life had been tied to her for a long time. The messages slowed, then changed in tone, shifting from casual concern to something closer to frustration, though still never direct she wanted acknowledgement. Some confirmation that she still mattered in the narrative of my life. What she got, instead, was nothing knowing there had been someone else to ignite anger or jealousy. It confirmed that the marriage had ended long before paperwork made it official, and that her confidence had been based on a future she believed was already secured. What unsettled her wasn't guilt or exposure, but the realization that her carefully planned update to her life no longer included an audience. I had stepped out of frame entirely, and without resistance or drama, I had taken away the one thing she relied on most, the illusion that she was always in control of how things ended. The confirmation didn't arrive in a dramatic way, and that felt fitting. It came through a third party who had no emotional stake in the situation, someone practical, uncomfortable, and apologetic about being involved at all. There was no build-up, no warning, just a folder shared quietly and a short message that said they thought I should see it for myself. I opened it alone in the apartment, sitting at the small kitchen table with a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. The contents were straightforward and exhaustive, messages archived over months. Photos taken in places I recognized, timestamps that overlap with nights she had claimed to be working late or visiting friends, and financial records that showed money moving in ways that no longer made sense in hindsight. There was no single moment of shock, no spike of anger. It felt more like the last piece clicking into place in a structure that had already been built. The tone of the messages was casual and confident, not secretive in the way people are when they're afraid of being caught, but relaxed, as if the outcome had already been decided. Plans discussed openly, trips referenced as if they were inevitable, assumptions made about how things would unfold once the paperwork was done. I wasn't betrayed in a moment. I had been managed over time. Seeing it laid out so clearly stripped the situation of any remaining ambiguity. This wasn't confusion or emotional drift. It was calculation. The timing of the divorce, the careful fairness of the documents, the expectation that I would react in predictable ways, all of it aligned with the idea that my presence had become an inconvenience rather than a partner. The marriage hadn't ended because something failed suddenly. It had ended because she had already secured what came next. What surprised me wasn't the evidence itself, but how little it moved me. There was no urge to confront her, no impulse to send screenshots or demand explanations. Those reactions belonged to a version of me that had still believed the relationship operated on mutual honesty. That version had quietly exited long before this proof arrived. What remained was clarity, and clarity lends itself to action rather than emotion. I didn't announce anything. I didn't accuse. I didn't let her know what I knew. I simply began closing doors. Shared accounts were separated cleanly and legally, investment positions unwound without commentary, automatic transfers canceled, joint access revoked where it was appropriate to do so. I followed processes, not impulses. Everything was done by the book, documented, precise, impossible to frame as vindictive. There were no threats, no warnings, just a gradual disappearance of structures she had assumed would remain available to her. Each step removed a point of leverage the more quietly it happened. The more effective it was there was no chaos for her to exploit, no emotional outburst she could reinterpret, no confrontation she could later reshape to fit her narrative. The system simply changed, and she was no longer at the center of it by the time the implications became clear. The options she might have used to regain control were already gone. I understood then that this was the opposite of revenge. Revenge seeks recognition. This was erasure, not of her, but of her influence over me. I wasn't punishing her for what she had done. I was responding to reality as it was, not as it had been presented to me. The decisions I made weren't fueled by bitterness, but by the absence of attachment. I wasn't trying to teach a lesson. I was closing a chapter with the same restraint she believed she had mastered. When everything was finalized on my end, the silence returned, heavier and more deliberate than before. I imagined her realizing that the situation no longer bent to her timing, that the space she had assumed she could navigate freely had narrowed without warning. I didn't feel satisfaction in that. I felt resolved. The cold calculation she had applied to end the marriage had been met with something she hadn't anticipated. Not confrontation, not collapse, but disengagement so complete that it left no room for manipulation. She showed up a few weeks later, and I knew it was her before I even opened the door, not because I sensed anything dramatic, but because there was a weight to the silence outside that felt familiar. When I opened it, she stood there looking smaller than I remembered, not physically, but stripped of the confidence she used to wear so carefully. No makeup, no styled hair, no calculated posture. Just tired eyes and a face that looked like it had run out of strategies. The hallway light behind me spilled onto her, and for a moment she hesitated, as if she hadn't expected me to actually be there, calm, grounded, unchanged. She didn't step forward right away. There was no sharp greeting, no controlled smile. She looked around the place briefly, the plain walls, the lack of personal touches, as if trying to understand how easily I had replaced the life she thought we shared. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it, uneven in a way that felt unfamiliar. She said she'd made a mistake, that things hadn't gone the way she imagined, that she thought I would fight for her, that I would demand answers or try to pull her back. The words came out carefully, but the meaning underneath them was rawer than she intended. As she talked, it became clear that this wasn't about losing me in the way people lose someone they love. It was about losing the reflection she expected to see in my reaction. She admitted, without quite realizing it, that she needed to feel wanted, pursued, validated by my resistance. My silence had left her alone with herself, and that was the part she hadn't planned for. The other man, the future she thought was guaranteed, hadn't filled the space the way she assumed it would. Without my attention, without my struggle, her certainty had collapsed. I listened without interrupting, without changing my expression. When she finally stopped, there was an expectant pause, the same kind she relied on so many times before, waiting for me to respond emotionally, to soften, to reassure her that she still mattered. Instead, I stepped aside slightly and picked up my phone from the table. I didn't say anything as I opened the folder, didn't announce what I was about to do. I simply handed it to her, screen facing up. She scrolled slowly at first, then faster, her breath catching as the messages and photos appeared one after another. The color drained from her face as recognition set in, not just of the evidence itself, but the fact that I already knew. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a confirmation. I watched her shoulders tense, her fingers tighten around the phone, the realization settling in that the narrative she had tried to regain control was already over. I didn't explain how I got it. I didn't accuse her or list grievances. There was no anger in my posture, no satisfaction in my silence. I simply stood there, letting the truth exist between us without decoration. When she looked up at me, her eyes were wet, but there was no dramatic breakdown, just a quiet unraveling. She started to speak again, to apologize, to say she never meant for it to go this far, that she didn't think I'd ever find out, that she didn't think it would matter this much. I shook my head once, not in frustration, but in finality. There was nothing left to negotiate. I didn't offer forgiveness because she wasn't asking for it for my sake. I didn't offer reconciliation because what she wanted wasn't a relationship. It was reassurance. Standing there in that bare apartment, I understood something with absolute clarity. She hadn't lost me that night at the table or the morning I left. She lost me the moment she decided my role in her life was to validate her worth rather than share it. I took the phone back and set it down, opening the door wider to signal the end of the conversation. She hesitated, searching my face one last time for something she could hold on to, but there was nothing there for her anymore. When she finally turned and walked away, I closed the door gently, not out of kindness or cruelty, but because the chapter had already ended, and for the first time, the silence that followed felt complete. When she finally walked away from that door, there was no dramatic collapse, No last attempt to turn back and reclaim something with words. Her steps down the hallway were slow and uneven, not because she hoped I would stop her, but because the understanding had fully settled in. She hadn't lost a boring husband or an outdated version of her life. She had lost stability, predictability, and the quiet safety she once dismissed as replaceable. I watched through the peephole as she reached the exit of the building, paused for a brief second, and then continued on, smaller with every step until she disappeared from view. That was the end, not with a bang, but with clarity. After that, things moved forward cleanly and without emotion. I sold my share of the remaining joint property to the proper channels, signing documents in offices that smell like paper and coffee, listening to neutral voices explain processes I already understood. There was no satisfaction in it, no bitterness, just completion. Each transaction closed another door that no longer needed to exist. Money moved, ownership changed, and the last structural ties between us dissolved quietly, the way they should have from the beginning. I didn't stay in that city long after. The temporary apartment had served its purpose, but it was never meant to become permanent. I accepted a new position in a different place, one that offered anonymity and momentum rather than familiarity. The move was practical, efficient, and free of nostalgia. I packed lightly, leaving behind anything that carried unnecessary weight. Not because I was running, but because I had learned the value of space. The new city didn't know my history, and I didn't feel the need to introduce it. The days filled themselves naturally with work, routines, small discoveries, cafes I liked, streets that felt right to walk at night, conversations that didn't carry expectations from previous life. I didn't announce my transformation or frame it as recovery. I simply lived differently, and that difference was enough. I never reached out to her again, and I didn't block her either. Silence didn't need reinforcement. It existed on its own, complete and self-sustaining. Whatever conclusion she came to afterward were hers alone to manage, I imagined, without indulging in it, that the absence continued to echo louder than any argument ever could, that the realization followed her into quiet moments when distraction failed. Not because I intended it to, but because moving on without explanation denies closure to those who rely on control. There were no final words exchanged, no grand statements about growth or forgiveness. I didn't need her to understand me, and I didn't need her regret. The punishment, if it could be called that, wasn't intentional. It was simply consequence. I didn't rebuild my life to make a point. I rebuilt it because the old one had already ended long before she tried to choreograph its conclusion. Looking back, the most decisive act I ever made wasn't leaving, signing papers, or cutting financial ties. It was refusing to linger in a role that no longer belonged to me. By continuing forward without looking back, without demanding acknowledgement, I reclaimed something essential. And somewhere behind me, in a story I no longer participated in, she was left to face the reality that the most painful ending isn't one filled with anger, but one where the other person simply goes on untouched and never returns.